Welcome back to the Red Dice Diaries, and in this GM tips video I'm going to be talking about GMs handling player failure. Now recently I published a players tips video about failure in RPGs, and you can see that by clicking on the video there. Now in the comments to that video, viewer Daemonworks asks, is there any chance of a companion tip video for GMs also relating to their handling of PC failure? In stories, it's frequently failures rather than successes that push a story forward. But that only really works if the GM makes the failure result something that feels interesting rather than punishing or boring. Now, Daemonworks is absolutely correct. The GM acts as the player's window into the roleplay world. Much of what their characters see, hear, and feel is prompted by GM's description. So, here are 5 pieces of advice for GMs when it comes to handling player failure. Number 1, make your descriptions interesting. This is the most basic piece of advice I can give, but it's more difficult to follow than it actually sounds, although practice definitely does help. If the players roll abysmally on their dice roll and fail a test or miss with an attack, try not to simply say, you miss or you fail. Let's face it, that's really boring and will not create much of a response from your players. Probably a sigh or a sort of, or at most a grumbled complaint about it. Whereas if you say you swing a mighty blow at the orc thug, but at the last second he parries your sword with his own and sparks fly from where they meet, this sounds far more dynamic, and you're probably more likely to get a suitably dynamic response from your players. Number 2, don't punish the players for failure. Now, dice rolls in RPGs with their pluses and their minus modifiers in most games represent a whole gamut of factors that might influence the success or failure of a roll. If a player is portraying someone who is particularly skilled in a certain area, but then they happen to get a poor dice roll, it can be very disheartening, and it does strain credulity a bit, since a person doesn't normally become dramatically less skilled at undertaking a task they are practiced in. However, a GM can phrase a dice roll failure to take other aspects of a situation into account, so it doesn't seem the action failed due to any lack of skill on the PC's behalf. Perhaps the trap on the lock was particularly fiendish, or to use our example from earlier, the character's sword swing would have hit the orc, but at the last second it was parried by their opponent. Phrasing dice roll failures like this can just help take the edge off a particularly poor dice roll. Number 3, turn as much narration as you can over to your players. Now, this is a trick I've been using a lot since I've been GMing Star Wars games in the Tides of Change community, and I'll put a link to them down below in the description. If possible, when a PC fails a roll, tell them that they have not been successful, and then, assuming your players are up for it, turn the narration over to them. Let them tell you how circumstances conspired to have them fail this challenge. Doing so makes it clear they're not being victimised, and it also allows them to describe how their actions were foiled in a manner they find interesting and fulfilling. And obviously as a GM you still have final refusal on anything like this. Number 4, use failed dice rolls to have complications or something interesting happen. When a player character fails at an action, use that as a springboard to have some additional complications occur, the scene change, or to have some other elements be brought to the fore. This not only helps take the sting out of failing an important task, but it also advances the story, and it offers players additional role-playing options. For example, in our earlier description of the orc parrying the player character's blow, perhaps when the greenskin parries the sword blow, he steps backwards, knocking over a brazier and setting fire to some of the wooden furniture, or maybe he deflects the PC's sword into an unlit lamp, spilling oil out across the floor. Alternatively, the orc could shout for reinforcements. And finally, number 5, reward players who accept failure with good grace. If you want to encourage players to accept failure, one of the ways to do this is provide some sort of reward related to it. After all, positive reinforcement normally works. Some games, like Fate, already have this sort of mechanic built in. However, even for games that don't, if someone really role plays their heart out and plays their character's reactions to their failure, keeping it IC during the situation, then recognising their efforts can go a long way towards encouraging other people to do likewise. If your game has any sort of inspiration or hero point system, perhaps doling one out for particularly good role-playing during a failure might help, or even introducing additional scenic elements that the PCs can take advantage of in future rounds. Our example of the lamp oil being spilt earlier is a good one. A canny PC could set the oil on fire to confound their attacker, use it to make a torch, try and trip their enemy over on the slippy oil, or otherwise use it to their advantage. And this is a situation where you're not only rewarding the player for having good grace during the failure, you're also encouraging them to invest more in the scene and role play with what's on hand, as well as keeping the scene dynamic and changing. So there we are. I hope that's answered your question a little bit, Daemonworks. Those 5 pieces of advice for GMs when it comes to handling player failure are: 1. Make your descriptions interesting. 2. Don't punish the players for failure. 3. Turn as much narration as you can over to your players. 4. Use failed dice rolls to have complications or something interesting happen. And 5. Reward players who accept failure with good grace. So I hope if you've enjoyed this video, you'll consider clicking on the red dice to subscribe to our channel. You can find us on Facebook, Google+, all the normal social media, links down below. I hope to see you next time in our next video. Until then, take care and happy gaming.